Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So I think that hard things are best done with each other. So today we're going to talk to Erin Williamson, who is the Programs Director and Strategy Officer at Love 146. They are an organization that is working to end child trafficking and exploitation through prevention, education, and support. The mission is one that we can all frankly support and would love to have in our community. And today she comes to help educate us to support our children and our community to end child trafficking and exploitation. Before you turn this off, and hopefully you keep listening, but I know that there is a feeling that child trafficking is something that would not happen to your child, to your community, to your child's friends. And the research shows us that that's not true. So I would encourage you to listen to this episode with an open mind so that you can protect your children, your children's friends, and your community. With that, let's welcome Erin.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. Okay. So we're going to be talking about a topic that I think honestly, even as a therapist, like this is an intense topic and it can be really scary as a parent thinking about trafficking, human trafficking, right? Could your kids be involved? Could something happen to them? Could your best friend's kids be involved? The neighbor kids, like anybody in your community. And so I'm glad you're here to help us kind of sort through this.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that has a lot of misconceptions. It can be very scary. And picking it apart and really understanding kind of what it is and what you can do as a parent, as a therapist, as anybody who's in a child's life is, I think, really important.
Yeah. Okay. So can we start by defining, like, what does it mean? Like when we hear human trafficking or child trafficking, right? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. So there's 2 types of trafficking. There's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. And really, when we're talking about labor trafficking, we're talking about anyone who is compelled to engage in labor, right? So that can be in the above ground economy or the underground economy, right? Like through force, fraud, or coercion, right? Those are like the 3 really important verbs because it is legal to work, right? And it's even legal for children to work. And so, how we differentiate between what's legal and what's illegal is really when there's force, fraud, or coercion.
Yeah.
When we're talking about sex trafficking, which is the exchange of any sexual act for any item of value, then there's really a differentiation between adults and children. When you're talking about adults, you have to have that force, fraud, or coercion. But when you're talking about children, you don't have to have that. And the way to remember that is to think there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Right? Once you kind of understand there's no such thing as a child prostitute, you recognize anything that would kind of fall under that theoretical label that falls into trafficking.
Okay. So does this happen in the US?
It does. And it happens way more than people think. I am one of those people, even in my own career, where I only thought it happened kind of over there, right? I started my career overseas, doing work overseas, really thinking that this was a problem overseas, and then was really challenged when I started working here in the US and started seeing kind of how significant of a problem it is and how under the radar it is. And I think that's both because people don't know about it, right? And so they don't have the language of what to say. And also traffickers are very skilled to get these kids to think that it's their decision or it's their fault or they're complicit somehow in what has happened to them. And so, you don't have kids or even adults coming forward and saying, I'm a victim of human trafficking. That's not kind of how disclosures happen when we're talking about trafficking victimization.
Yeah. So it can be to a place where you could be sex trafficked and not understand that is what's happening.
Yes. So oftentimes when we meet with children, we start the conversation by saying, look, we work with youth who have had to make really difficult decisions and been in really difficult situations, right? And then we talk to them about what does grooming look like, right? A lot of times the thing to remember is, when kids meet predators, and this is true of trafficking and, other forms of exploitation, predators don't identify themselves that way, right? There's this whole grooming and recruitment process. And through that, predators are trying to figure out what is the gap and missing gap that they can fill in that kid's life. Is it that they're food insecure, or they're housing insecure, or maybe their system involved in looking for a family or a father figure or a romantic partner? Really, whatever that child's looking for, that's what that predator is going to try to fill to create that bond with that child. And they're going to kind of deepen that bond over time, so that by the time they get to the exploitation, right, they've created a very tight bond with that child. And in many cases, they've pulled that child away from other people in their lives that they had relationships with. And so oftentimes when we're talking with these youth, the people who really are their traffickers legally, they're referring to as their boyfriend, right? Or as their best friend, or as, the father figure they never had, or the parents. We've seen couples trafficking children, the parents they never had. And so part of the work of a therapist or law enforcement officer or first responder, whoever kind of comes in contact with these youth, is helping them to understand that things that were set up to seem like they were making a decision and seem like they had a choice were really kind of set up by that predator in that false way, right? The predators started saying things like, well, if you love me, well, we could create a future together, if only, and really led them to the decisions that resulted in their exploitation.
Yeah. Wow. Is there anything about like child trafficking, especially when we're thinking about sex trafficking, that are misconceptions that parents think of?
Yes, absolutely. Right. Okay. So now we're at a point where, when I started this work 20 years ago, really no one had heard of the term of human trafficking. It was very, very nascent. Now we're at the point where there's movies about it. There's Law and Order SVUs, episodes about it. One of the challenges we have still is, while those things have brought a lot of attention and many of it's good, sometimes there's misconceptions, right? There's still the idea of like, this is kidnapping. This is a stranger danger type of thing, right? And, just like when we think about child sexual abuse, so often it's done by somebody that child doesn't identify as a stranger, right? And that doesn't mean that person wasn't initially a stranger. I just want to be clear, right? Sometimes it is a teacher. We've had teachers, we've had, clergy members, we've had family members. There's a number of kids we've worked with where their families have been involved. But other times we've had people who have met people online, right? And so, but again, by the time they're being exploited, that's no longer some stranger online. That is my boyfriend or my best friend. That is somebody who, I really have a connection with. And I think it's very hard for those of us who are older to realize that, the differentiation between who you know in real life and who you know online is so much blurrier for younger kids than it is for us, right? For them, there really is, very little difference, especially for kids that maybe don't have a really strong social network in their school or in their communities. Their communities are online, and those really are their closest friends.
Yeah, that's tricky because I was thinking about even kids that are neurodiverse too, right? And I read an article, I feel like it was an opinion, not something that was research-based, but it was talking about people that were neurodiverse, I think specifically ADHD, that there was like a higher likelihood that they could have one of these adverse childhood events in terms of sex trafficking or sexual abuse. And it makes sense that that could happen because of maybe their the group or what they're looking for in terms of belonging isn't within their own community. And so then they would look outside of that, and then that might present an opportunity, right? It's a lot of mights, but I think it could be the perfect setup for something like that to happen.
Absolutely. And we see that, right? So traffickers are going to target kids that they think are vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? And unfortunately, kind of neurodivergence is a vulnerability. And especially if that disability might not be initially recognizable, right? And very, right here, you have now a young child who might be more susceptible to the messages that you're saying. They
Mhm.
might have more immediate trust in you
Yeah.
than a child who doesn't have a neurodivergence might be, right? Where they might be more suspicious, they might be more standoffish, they might test certain things about you. You know, children who are neurodivergent, oftentimes one of the wonderful things about them is they are so trusting, right?
Mhm.
And they do want to ingratiate themselves, and they just think of the world in a different way. And so certainly we do see traffickers unfortunately take advantage of that. It's one of the many things, right? It's similar
Mhm.
to, when we see kids who are, having housing insecurity or food insecurity. Again, whatever the trafficker can kind of take advantage of, they're going to do that.
Mhm. Are there other things that you think that they exploit? You said like those family things. I'm thinking about also like gangs, right? Are gangs a part of this trafficking?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We do see significant gang involvement, right? Especially among the female gang members, right? It's not uncommon for the female gang members to be trafficked as part of bringing money into the gang
Mhm.
system. And oftentimes, to be honest, that's also where we'll see intergenerational trafficking, where, especially if you have intergenerational gang membership, right? Where the grandmother was a part of it and now the parents are a part of the gang, the children, they grew up in this, right? This
Mhm.
is normal to them. And so,
Mhm.
what we forget, I think, as adults, that if you grew up and this is all you've ever known and all of your social network is part of this gang,
Mhm.
there's no decision as to whether or not you're going to be a member of this gang. You just are growing up. You're a member of this gang. And so as you get older, as your body starts to develop, there starts to become more expectations that, especially if you're female, that this is part of what you're going to do as your membership of the gang.
Yeah. Well, and I think, in the area I live in, there is not a lot of gang activity, but very close by there is. And so I think people don't sometimes think like it wouldn't happen in our community, right? Like, okay, so there aren't any gangs. There would not be trafficking. But these are, I mean, there are people that are trafficked that are part of somewhat, I don't want to say normal because I feel like that's not a
Ab-
real, but like the average family.
Absolutely. And you're right. And that's part of, again, how trafficking kind of stays underground, right? There's this false narrative, and it's really a protective narrative that people
Mhm.
have of like, oh, this could never happen in my community. And certainly while your kids or your community might have different vulnerabilities, right? Kids are by default vulnerable, right?
Mhm.
Children, as they grow up, they want to be part of something. They want to be
Yes.
loved. They want to be accepted, right? There are different ways that predators get to our children. We have pulled up to mansions and those kids have been trafficked, right? We have
Mhm.
served kids. Now, obviously, food insecurity was not the vulnerability that
Sure.
that child had. But
Mhm.
sometimes it's actually that both parents worked so hard and had such high demanding jobs that that child was online and nobody was
Mhm.
monitoring what was happening with that child online. And so, again, the grooming and recruitment and even some of the initial exploitation was happening online. And by the time somebody became aware of it, it had kind of already started down that slope towards human trafficking, or maybe had already happened, right?
Mhm.
So, I live in Connecticut. We've had a program here serving survivors in Connecticut since 2014. We've served over 1,000 kids in Connecticut, right? You would not think of Connecticut generally as, a place where a lot of, there's not a ton of, it's very serious gang activity. It's generally a well-resourced state. We have worked with kids in every single county across this state.
Mhm. Yeah. Which means it can happen anywhere to
Yes.
anyone potentially, right? So what are the things like now that we have that fear factor, right? Our stomach is kind of hurting and we're like, okay, great. This could be really bad, right? But like what can we do to protect our kids? Like what are the things that you see are more the protective factors that we can put in place to help our
Yep,
children?
absolutely. And I love that question. So, first of all, if you go to our website, love146.org, right at the top of the screen, there's a banner and it's to sign up for emails specifically targeting parents, right? Specifically for parents, talking to them about how do you start these conversations? How do you have it? What if kind of you've gone so far and now you're like, oops, I might need to pull it back. And what we
Yeah.
do is we kind of we really talk specifically there about the internet, but it really can it can pertain to even in-person kind of conversations and exploitation. And we equate it to teaching a child to cross the street, right? You would not take your 6-year-old and go to New York City and drop them off in the middle of Manhattan and say, I'm going to be back in an hour. Good luck, be safe. Right. But that is virtually what we do when we hand a 6-year-old a tablet with no parental controls and no guidance. Right. We are basically dropping them off in the middle of New York City. And so just like when you have a young child, you at first hold their hand, you talk them through it, you look both ways, you explain why you look both ways, right? You cross the street. And the first couple of times you do this, you make sure you're holding your hands, you're repeating what the instructions are and why you're doing it, right? Eventually that child, you're going to drop their hand, right? And at some point, that child is going to cross their street on their own without you, right? And the goal is that by the time they are 18, they can cross any street, even busy ones, even New York City without you. And we have to think of introducing technology in the same way, right? We really do have to have age-appropriate conversations as young as they're getting these devices, right? And we talk to kids about how, first of all, we as adults have to put some parental controls on our devices. Unfortunately, industry has proven that they are not going to do this, right? They are not going to proactively create applications or software, or hardware that is protecting our children. And so we're going to have to put stuff on our devices to protect children. And we're going to then have to have conversations with our children. And these are age appropriate conversations, right? At a young age, it might be something as simple as saying, we have no secrets in our family. I just want you to know if anybody ever asks you to keep a secret, I want you to tell them my family doesn't have secrets, right? And that's a great thing because predators are going to test, can this child keep this secret, right? And so if that child says my family doesn't have secrets, that sends a message to that predator that this child is not somebody that is quote unquote safe for them to pursue because that child is more likely to disclose, right? And then again, you set parameters. This is the app, right? Here's the ABC Mouse app. We trust this app. This app is for, age appropriate. Go here. Eventually, right, you're going to have a child who you're giving them more access, right? I have a teenager. He has his own phone. When he got his own phone, we had to have discussions, right? One of the discussions we had is you can never unsee something. So if you're sitting there kind of frozen and you're not sure if you should swipe or not, swipe. Just do it because you can't unsee it. We also had conversations about the fact that he's probably going to come across pornography online, right? Just you type in, you have a class assignment for the state of Virginia and you type that in wrong, you're going to see a lot of different things, right? And we also have monitoring software on his phone. We had a whole conversation with him. You're allowed to have secrets. You're allowed to have privacy, but that has to happen when you pick up the phone and call someone. That has to happen in a journal. Your phone is not some place that you can have privacy, right?
I love that. Yes.
Right. It's just not. There's other places you can have privacy, but your phone's not one of them. And again, really explaining. And I will say, I had the child who through the fit was the only kid that didn't have the iPhone and it lasted for about 6 weeks. It was a painful 6 weeks, both for him and us as parents. And now it's gone, right? Like now this is just his phone. And he realizes he's actually not missing out on all these things he thought he was. Would he like to have the iPhone that everyone else has? Sure. But he doesn't. He has something called the Bark phone because what the Bark phone does is it allows us to monitor his Snapchat messages. And I said to him, apps that I put on Apple won't let me monitor your Snapchat messages. You can either have Snapchat or and have the Bark phone or, have a very, very locked down iPhone, but you will not have Snapchat on it. And I will tell you, it uses AI and it sends us notifications. There have been some notifications, even through my child, with my child knowing we're monitoring it. And he has come to us and said, Mom, I've taken myself out of some group chats because now I just look at who it is and I can see, oh, this is not going to be an appropriate group chat. So
Yes.
he's learning the skills of decision making, of, what does he want to be a part of? What does he not want to be a part of? Eventually he'll get an iPhone. Eventually he'll get, we won't be as monitoring as much, certainly he'll go off to post-secondary education and he'll be, but at 13, his mind is still so nascent and he's still figuring things out. And in fact, what we're seeing right now with boys, especially, is, he's a gamer. He's on his game system a lot. We are seeing a lot of sextortion on gaming system of boys. And so, the other thing I want to say is we think a lot of our girls and there's kind of a tendency to over focus on the girls. And I understand that, but we're actually seeing a lot of sextortion of boys. And unfortunately, because we haven't talked about that as a culture, we're seeing those kids more quickly. It escalates to suicide. And so it's really important to have these conversations with our boys as well.
Yes. Well, and I think regardless of all these things, right? Like we know that there is a higher prevalence of girls being sexually abused, but that doesn't mean that boys are not sexually abused, right? Like,
absolutely.
So I think, these conversations with both girls and boys, and I mean, every kid, there is not, because if it's not them, it will probably be somebody they know. Right. Absolutely. And so then it's like I am always like, okay, having the conversations about everything, right? Obviously age appropriate, but like we talk about sex in our house. We talk about, relationships, like what healthy relationships look like, right? Like my 9-year-old, excuse me, is nowhere close to dating. Right. Like fingers crossed, right? Like we're really far from that. But I want her to know what is healthy and unhealthy so that when she's in a relationship later, it's not that she's learning about that for the first time, right? When she feels like she loves somebody, right? Also with my 13-year-old son, like we're talking about these things, but we have been for years because he's getting closer to that age where dating may be something he wants to investigate. And so I want him to know how to do it. And so we are talking about these things, but I think the online gaming part so tricky because there's so much about that I don't understand as a parent. So I'm continually trying to like educate myself and like, we don't do the headphones so that I can hear what's going on. Right. And there's just so many parts of things of like, I think our kids want to be protected and they also want freedom. Right.
Absolutely.
And I think both those things can happen. It's just that they don't get total freedom.
Agree.
Go ahead.
One of the conversations that we had recently with our oldest child was this concept of like, look, we have family rules. There's rules everywhere, right? There's so many rules for kids. There's rules in school, there's rules in sports, there's rules at home. And I said, but you're hitting this age where part of what your kind of quote unquote job is to push up against those boundaries, right? To test those rules, right? And what I want you to know is when you break one of those rules, because you will probably break one of our rules, the most important thing to me in that moment is your safety. Yeah. And the most important thing to dad, to me, is that you if there's something you need to tell an adult and it's not us, you tell some adult, right? And I think preemptively telling kids that, in those moments where they break rules and bad things happen, that, it's not the fact that they broke the rule that's the most important thing. It's their safety and their health, because so many kids that we've talked to have said, I didn't tell anyone because, my mom told me not to leave the house and I broke her rule, or I wasn't supposed to be at that party, or my parents told me I should never drink alcohol and I did. And so, they're more focused in that moment on the fact that they broke a rule than on what egregious act happened to them. And so again, I think as parents, we need to proactively tell these kids, rules are in place to protect you, but if something happens to you, we need to figure it out together, right? Because that fear over breaking the rule, and that unfortunately that is so it is what parents, I think, instinctively go back to when they hear their kid, oh, I told you not to do this, or you shouldn't have done that. And I think unfortunately we do that to protect ourselves, because we want to think that we have some control over what's going to happen to our kids. And the reality is that, bad things happen, right? It's there's no way to 100% protect your child, and to also teach your child that the world is an amazing place, and you want them to experience all that life has to offer, and not be so terrified that they are frozen, and can't, live their fullest life possible. And that's very, very hard, especially for people who kind of understand, understand trafficking, understand sexual abuse, understand that it really does profoundly impact children when it does happen. But all I'll say is, my kids still go on sleepovers. My kids still have access to games and to phones. We have lots of conversation. We have, like you do, it sounds like, lots of open dialogue. We talk, about how if anyone ever does anything to make them feel uncomfortable, they have a right to say no. They have a right to say, my body, my space. They have a right to come and tell mommy and daddy, or any other adult that they feel safe with. But I also want them to know that the world's amazing, and that most people are amazing, and aren't people to be afraid of.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to have that balance of like, you don't want kids to think you can trust everyone.
Yep.
But we also don't want to be suspicious of everyone. Right. So it's that balance. And so I think, in our house, we talk about gut feelings, or like that feeling, like, what does your gut say? Like, does this feel like a good idea? Right. To like, even though, so right now we have a 3, 7, 9, and 13-year-old. Everybody, I mean, we have half the group getting ready to turn the next age. So we're right in the middle of that. But, we talk about these things often, of like in different things for different kids. But like, even this morning I was taking a shower and my 3-year-old was in the bathroom, and I was like, hey, can anybody else see your penis? And he was like, no. And I was like, what if it's your sister's? And he was like, no, we keep our bodies private. And I was like, and that was just like a 10-second conversation, right? Because I'm like, the more we're reminding of just the things we want our kids to know, and not inundating, right? But it was just a random thing that came to my mind.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I just asked the question, right? And I had a conversation with one of my daughters a couple days ago. We were talking about honesty, right? And I think, it's hard because like sometimes you're going to get in trouble. Like there might be a consequence for the thing that you do. And so you might be like,
right.
like what is the right thing to say here? Like, what you want to say, and then what the truth is. And, it's hard to do that. And so we have a lot of conversations about honesty too, of like the real important part, like you're saying, is their safety. And I haven't put it in those words, so I like that. So I'm going to steal that from you. Thank you. But is that we're a team in our family. And so we all succeed. Like all of us are winning when all of us are working together. And so that means mommy and daddy have to know what's really going on, right? Because we're your biggest support. Like we want you to succeed, and we want you to live your best life. And so we have to know what the real truth is. And we had a conversation. It was something so minor that had been lied about. And we were like, okay, so here is the challenge. If we don't tell the truth about things, then when something big does happen, because something big is going to happen, somebody is going to say you did something or didn't do something. And then it will be hard for me to know what to believe, because I want to believe you most. But it's really hard if I know that you haven't been honest in the past, and that will make me feel confused, because I don't know which way to go. Right. And so we had that conversation a couple of weeks ago. And then there was a situation that was like super minor. I think I said, did you clean your ears out after you showered? I think that was it. Right. So something so parent. Right. And she was like, yeah. And I didn't see any Q-tips anywhere. And she is like the worst about throwing them away. And I was like, are you sure? And she was like, yes, I really did. And I was like, okay, that's fine. I just, I know that it bothers me when I have water in my ears, and I just wanted to make sure that you had that memory to do that, right? And it wasn't a big deal, but it was like, she was like, why did you ask me twice? And I was like, remember how we talked about the honesty piece? I just wasn't sure because there were some things. And she was like, no, I really did. And I was like, okay. And I moved on, right? But I think it's these little things that we're coaching kids to trust us to share the information, right? So I mean, do you see that too, of like,
yeah, it's funny. I have this story that I share sometimes of my youngest, who's unfortunately an excellent liar. My oldest cannot lie at all. He has all these facial giveaways. It's very easy to tell. My youngest, she could lie and you would just 100% believe her.
yeah,
And when she was little, I remember her, we were at the end of COVID. We were towards the end of the pandemic, and schools were no longer saying like how many kids had COVID. And I had kind of heard that there was an uptick. And I said to her, picked her up one day from school, and I said, well, just curious, how many kids were in your class today? And she goes, I was the only one. And I go, what do you mean you were the only one? And she goes, it was just me. It was just me and my teacher. And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah. And I go, well, what did you do all day? She goes, we played on the playground. And my son comes out of the school, and I tell him, and he's looking at me like, Mom, you're an idiot. Right. I go, this is what she's telling me. I go, well, maybe I should email your teacher and thank her. And she's like, yeah, you should email my teacher. I want to see what you email her. And then I want to see you press send. Right. And we're going back and forth, and 20 minutes in, my son goes, wait, wasn't so-and-so on the bus? And isn't he in your class? And she goes, yeah, he switched classrooms. Right. I mean,
wow, she was really committed.
Oh, very committed. This went on for about 40 minutes. I ended up actually driving to that kid's house and saying, the mom looks at me saying, hey, so-and-so, were you in school today? And he's looking at me like, yeah. I go, whose classroom were you in? And he said, her teacher. And I said, in the car. And we had a long talk. But in my mind, while this seems so innocent and is a funny story because of the age she was in kindergarten, in my mind, I'm imagining, okay, now you're a teenager and you're telling me that you're sleeping at your friend's house. Mm-hmm. You're actually out somewhere, right? So I need to start sending this message at a very early age. Yep. Not only that you cannot lie, but that I will show up someplace if I think you're lying, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes we think things are cute at a younger age, and we're not thinking long term. Are we teaching them the lesson that's going to serve them in the long run, mm-hmm. right? Or are we encouraging something because at 3 and 4 and 5, it's cute, but you know what? It's not going to be cute when they hit 12 and 13 and 14. No. And they're not going to understand why something that was so cute when they were younger is now not cute and so serious.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think this is a protective factor, right? Like this is a way that we're also protecting our kids is by doing that, scaffolding. We're putting that scaffolding in place for the later years because, the problems, although I hope the problems are small as big kids, but we haven't gotten to the teenage size problems really yet. And I get that we have more frequency of issues as young children, right? And we feel like, oh, those are so hard. But when they get older, the problems are so much weightier, right? They have a lot more weight behind them. Maybe they happen less frequently, but they're a really big deal. And, those kids have access to cars and have access to other things, right? That could be dangerous for them. And so we want our kids to know, I think it teaches them how much we care about them, right? Setting rules. Our kids want rules, right? Like I remember something that has stuck with me for years is I had a teenage girl patient who was talking to me about procrastination. And she was like, I just want my parents to take my phone from me. And I was like, wait, hold on. You want your parents to take your phone from you? And she was like, yeah, because then I wouldn't have that distraction from me. And I'm not saying everybody feels that way, right? But I think it was just to the power of sometimes it's hard to put it down. Sometimes it's hard to have the breaks. And so like we have to help coach our kids and teach them how to do that. And that's love, right? Like that's how we're also demonstrating that care. They may hate it. Like you said, you're a teenager, they're a gigantic fit and you have to endure it. Right. So I remember we say like 2 weeks for like babies, like when I was trying to decide on like the sleep training as like a little baby, like, do I want to do this or not? Or how am I going to navigate through this parenting dilemma? They would say like it won't last longer than 2 weeks unless there's a medical issue. So it's like maybe the teenager demanding an iPhone will only last for 6 weeks unless there's a medical issue. Right. Like, but I think it's like we have to set up for that and not give in to that simply because they want it. But like it doesn't mean just because they want something. I mean, there's plenty of things I want.
Right. And that's like, what I tell my child.
Yeah.
Right.
That it is not the best thing. But I think, yeah, I mean,
I also think we have to remember, we have kids, we'll talk to them about their online activities and they'll have all of these connections online, right? And then you ask them, who could you go to if you had an emergency? And I cannot tell you the number of kids who online have so many connections, but cannot name a single person in real life that they could go to if they felt they had an emergency. And so there's this massive disconnect between, what are social connections for these kids and what are real deep connections of people that they feel they can trust and rely on. And you think about those children who can't identify single people or maybe they can identify one person that they could do if they had a true emergency, right? So, I also want us to say it's not just your kids, right? There are kids that your friends are, your children are friends with other children, right? And the reality is that not everybody has a home that's safe, and not everybody has an adult in their life that's having these conversations that has said to them, you can come to me if you ever need anything. And so, the other thing that we can do to protect not just our children, but that their social network is to just simply say to their friends one time when they're over, y'all are like, great. We love having you here. I know you all have your own parents and stuff, but if you ever need anything, I just want you to know that we're also here for you. You can always come to us. You can always ring us. We're here to help you too. We care about all of you. And those children may never take you up on that offer, but for the child that needs to hear that there's a caring adult that they could go to in their life, they will take that piece of information and they will tuck it into their pocket. And that will add to their protection later on in a way that you may never realize. But it's so vital that we not only protect our children, but we expand that protection to their social networks and to other, you have nieces, you have nephews, you have people in your religious community, wherever you come across children, letting kids know that you are there for them, you can be there for them if they need someone is so vital.
Yes. I love that. So with our kids, I did an interview once, and we were talking about a protective factor being having 5 people that your kids could go to. And so talking to those people and saying, hey, would you be willing to do this? Talking to your kids and say, here are the 5 people. Like you can go to anyone you want, right? Yep. But here are 5 people that you could go to and have agreed that at any time, here's their phone numbers. Here's how you can do this. And this year, my younger kids were getting a thing called a tin can. I don't know if you've heard of this. Yep. I love it because it's like the old school phone, right? And you get to pick who's in it and they can call other kids that have tin cans, right? But it's like we had as kids where you're having these real conversations on the phone, which I loved growing up, right? Like that kind of connection. I feel like the texting kind of conversations are just not the same. Right. Like as having a phone conversation, but I obviously love in person the most, but I like that they can call and talk and say, oh, this thing or whatever. But then, with that or any phone that you get that's, hooked up to your Wi-Fi or to the wall, we're going to put the list of their numbers there so that if they need to call one of those people, so some of them are relatives, some of them are friends, parents, grandparents, right? These different people. So they can call those different people to say they have something that they want to talk about. And I think it is helpful, because I know that there are times where as a teenager, I just wanted to talk to somebody else besides my parents, to just say, like, this thing is going on, and I talked to my parents about it, or I didn't talk to them and I need advice. I mean, even as I'm 41, and I still like to talk to people and say, like, okay, so this is a situation I'm in. What advice do you have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember having conversations with my younger cousins that older adults in our family said,
Mhm.
we really need you to have this conversation because she's going to take it differently from you than
Yeah.
she is from me. And now those cousins that I spoke to, I'm going to and saying, get ready because you're about to
Yeah.
have a conversation with my kid now, right? Remember that
Yes.
conversation I had with you?
Yes.
Those cousins text me. They say, I remember getting a text once from one of them saying, like, I know I rolled my eyes, but I actually used your some of the stuff you told me in that conversation the other night. Thanks.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so, I do
Yeah.
think sometimes we also have to think of like who should be the messenger for our kids,
Mhm.
right? We can tell them stuff and certainly when they're younger, right? We have more I think leverage and authority in their life
Sure.
and they care.
Yeah.
As they get older, bring in those neighbors, those older neighbors, bring in those older relatives and have them reinforce, kind of what you're saying. I remember pulling some of our neighbors aside and saying, now that you have a phone and you're older, what's one thing you wish you had done differently? Or
Mhm.
one thing you wish you had known that you didn't know, right? And having them say it just hits differently. And so
Yeah.
that's another way to, try to reinforce that,
Mhm.
yes, you're their mom. Yes, you're coming at it from a certain angle, but also like there is some validity in what you're sharing with them and you can
Yes.
take it from another kid, right?
Yep. Yeah, as a therapist, I sometimes get to be in that weird place because I'm like a grown up, but I'm not their parent. And I'm also, like I had a kid the other day who told me that I look 21. I'm going to go with that. Right. So I'm falling into this middle zone. And so I get to have cool conversations with kids with those kind of things too, but not everybody has that. So like, I love this idea of just expanding that network and encouraging our kids to say like, hey, you could talk to Matt about this, or you could talk to Sarah about this, or, so and so might have a good idea about this. Like, would you like to talk to them about it? Right. And I think our
Yeah.
kids do sometimes need that setup. Like, they don't know exactly how to do it yet. Right. And it might be awkward to bring some of the stuff up. So, setting it up or having other people bring up a conversation, I've definitely done that for tons and tons of people in my personal life. And also, I do it a lot at work too. Okay, so we've talked also. Okay, before we move on to this, I think, something I think that I have made sure to honor in our house is like our kids will say no to each other, and sometimes some to no to me, right? Like I'm tickling them or something, and they'll be like, no, stop, or whatever. And as soon as they say that, I immediately honor that, even if I'm like, they're having so much fun. They love being tickled, right? Or whatever the dynamic is, we take that very seriously because I want them to know what the response to no should be.
Yes, absolutely. And earlier you were even talking about talking to your kids about healthy relationships. I think, again, going back to home, not everyone is growing up in a healthy
Sure.
relationship, right? Not
Yeah.
everyone knows the difference. But even if you grew up in a healthy relationship, if you don't have those conversations explain what is healthy about
Yeah.
this, right? Your kids can grow up and end up in an unhealthy relationship and kind of look around and be like, how did I get here?
Yes.
Right? Because it's never occurred to them that a relationship could be abusive or unhealthy
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
all they saw growing up were healthy relationships. So they assumed that all relationships were that
Yes.
way. And so
Exactly.
again, I think you have to you're almost dictating to them, right? It's okay that we sometimes argue in front of you. Here's what you need to know. It's okay for people to disagree. The most important thing is you talk it through, right? And you
Mhm.
figure it out together, right?
Yeah.
If you grew up in a household where there was no arguments, you might not learn the skills about how to talk things through or how to argue and come out on the other side, right? You
Mhm.
may end up with a partner who doesn't know that. And you have to know why it is or isn't important to you to be able to voice your opinion, to be able to engage in those conversations. I think that all of that, to your point, being able to set your boundaries. We have a prevention education curriculum called Not a Number that we do in, in school settings, in juvenile justice facility, anywhere where kids congregate, that we can do it. And we teach facilitators to implement it who are already kind of working with these kids. And one of the things we focus on the most is really helping kids to understand what a boundary is, to understand that their boundaries are going to be different with different people, right? They're going to have different boundaries with their friends than they do with their parents, than they do with a romantic partner, than they do with an acquaintance or a coach. And figuring out what those boundaries are, and also what are they going to do if and when that somebody tries to cross those boundaries, right? Because that's also going to be different depending on who that person is in their life, right? So talking a lot about like what are your boundaries, right? And I think as parents, it one of the ways that we can approach this is asking, inquiring, and really trying to do it in a non-judgmental manner, right? What are your boundaries? What do you think that they would be? How would you feel about this? What if somebody did this? And really just all we're trying to do with those conversations at a younger age is getting them to think about it and to be aware that something like a boundary could exist and that they have a right to set their own boundaries.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes they don't even know what that means.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think if I ask the average 8-year-old, what is a boundary?
Right.
They would be like, no idea. I mean, I don't even know if they could come up with fence or something, right? Like that is just not like a word that they're probably very familiar with. So it's teaching that thing. And I think a lot of adults actually
100%.
struggle with boundaries, right? And they also have a misconception about what boundaries are. Boundaries are to help everybody be successful, right? So I think they get a bad rap sometimes, like, oh, because of somebody's boundary. Well, no, that's a good, because then we know where success lives. It's outside of that part, right? Like it's within this perimeter, or not within this space or whatever. I think it is, boundaries are great because then you know where the limit is, and then you're going to have more success. And so to enforce and to share boundaries is amazing. And I think, it's hard because if we don't know how to set our own boundaries, then it's hard to teach our kids. And so, unfortunately, as parents, a lot of the things start with us, but not everybody is going to have parents who are in a place where they can do that, but they can also still learn, right? And you can still grow. And that's why teachers and coaches and friends, parents and neighbors and these different people that can be real assets, right? But I think also in this conversation, there can be exploitation in those places too when we're looking. So like also teaching our kids to trust themselves, of like, if something doesn't feel right, there's probably something not right.
Yes. And it's interesting because you sometimes still hear, and I've heard it even with my children when they've been with other children. I've heard other parents say, well, you always have to listen to what a teacher says, or you always have to listen to, and whenever I hear comments like that, I pause, right? Because the reality is that predators try to sometimes place themselves in those positions because the message to children is you have to listen to them, right? And so there's this balance that we have to kind of teach our kids of, yes, generally we want to be respectful for all people, right? And we want to listen to people. And if something doesn't feel right, like you said, trust your gut over that, right? I would rather have my kid come home and say to me, my teacher asked me to kind of go with them into this other classroom to do some extra assignment, but it didn't sit right with me. And so I said no. And that teacher reach out to me and be upset and me explain why I think that was okay for my child to say no in that moment. Then for my child to kind of learn to override that gut feeling. Because unfortunately, what we see a lot from the youth that we work with is that, something happened for many of them at a younger age that wasn't taken seriously, right? Many of our kids have high, what's called ACE scores, right? Adverse childhood experiences. So many have experienced physical abuse or prior sexual abuse or some kind of, again, these are things that put them at risk for later exploitation. And oftentimes how that was handled, right? If their parents didn't believe them or if they didn't see anything happen, then they have started to question their gut, right? And
Mhm.
so again, to your point, I think really reinforcing that guttural response is important because um, for many of us, that's what keeps us, from walking down the alley, from putting ourselves in situations that might potentially be dangerous, is just this
Mhm.
instinctual feeling
Yep.
of I don't think I'm going to go into that door. I don't think I'm going to follow that person.
Mhm.
That's making me nervous, so I'm going to
Mhm.
choose a different path.
Yeah, yeah, so good. Okay, so what other grooming things? Because we said, people who are exploiting children are grooming, right? Which is this act of like basically breaking down these barriers or like removing this gut feeling so that kids trust what they're saying, even adults, right? Like,
Yes,
but grooming, especially, I think when I think about it, is around kids, but I think adults could be groomed too.
absolutely.
Yeah. So talk to me about what it looks like. What are the warning signs? What should parents be looking for?
Yeah, and I think, it somewhat depends, right? So I do want to go back to the idea that, we do work with children who are exploited by family members, right?
Mhm.
And so for some of those children, this is their norm. This is all they've known. This is what they've grown up with. They've been exploited from a very, very young age. Sometimes they knew that there was a commercial exchange associated with their sexual abuse. Sometimes they didn't know there was a commercial exchange. Sometimes we have kids that give their parents money for rent, and their parents maybe don't actively exploit them, but they don't ever ask questions about how they get that money, right? Because they
Mhm.
depend on it for rent. They depend on it for food. And so there's different ways that kind of that grooming and that exploitation can show up. And sometimes it really is, these kids, when we say they're in difficult situations and have to make difficult decisions, I mean, we really are talking about kids who know, if I don't get this money for my mom to help her pay rent, we're going to get evicted, and my younger siblings are going to go without, right? Those are situations that children should never be put in, and unfortunately they are. Um, and it's very hard in those situations because those kids know, if I disclose what's happening to me, I'm probably going to be removed from my family, right? My family's
Mhm.
probably going to be broken up. And so again, I just want to emphasize that, many kids don't disclose what's happening to them because, one, they don't see what is happening as exploitation, right? That is a child who might say, "Oh no, my mom is not part of this. This is something I'm quote unquote choosing to do," but their
Mhm.
mom's not protecting them and is not
Mhm.
asking questions and is not kind of serving that role that they should be as a parent, making sure their child is not in that situation. And so sometimes it can take the form of that. Other times, when especially when it's not a familial person, or if it's a familial person that's a little further removed, right, then it can look like things like meeting needs, right? And sometimes those needs are real needs, like their basic needs, food and shelter, and sometimes they're more superficial needs, right? We've had kids who have been exploited because they wanted different things, different skins in games, or they wanted to be able to have their hair done or their nails done in a way that just made them fit in, made
Mhm.
them, seem like they were like all the other kids, and traffickers exploited them, right? And oftentimes, "I want to do this for you, I care about you."
Mhm.
um, the other thing is that when we look at kind of as parents what we should look for, a lot of times when we see the behaviors, there's a misassociation that it might be drug use, right? And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. Oftentimes kids, especially older adolescents, they'll become secretive, right? They
Mhm.
won't want to share who they're talking to on their phones. They won't want to give you information. They won't want to talk about who they're dating or where they're going, right? Or they'll just say out and walk out of the house, right? And they might be, "When will you be back?" "Whenever, when I'm back," right? They'll give these very short, very curt answers, some of which is like age appropriate, but some of which is, you know, that they're protecting their trafficker, or they don't want you to know. And so in those situations where it might seem easier to just fine, let it go, I'm not gonna, you do have to unfortunately lean into those moments and kind of demand that type of information, because again, and I know it's harder as they get older, but like, you are still their parent, right? You are their parent. And even though we like to adultify our children at very young ages, the reality is the research shows their brains are just not fully developed. And, some of the latest research says it might even be not up until age 30, right? Certainly there's a lot of research to show up until age 25, and research continues to extend that kind of, quote unquote, childhood later and later. And so, 17 and 16, when you think about that, they have another 9, 10, maybe 13 years before their brains are fully developed. They really do still need you to serve as their parent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is hard because, we imagine that at 18, because it's some magical number that was selected that says you're an adult at this age. And that doesn't mean that they're ready to do all the adult things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if most of us look back on how, what we were doing when we were 18 to 25, many of us made some stupid mistakes, and many of us were put in situations where we look back and we think, oh, either something bad did happen to me, or, but for the grace of God, something bad didn't happen, but it certainly could have.
Yeah. Yeah. So what other things do you think, what are we looking for with grooming? So we said, it's tricky because sometimes their families, it's normally, it's somebody who builds our trust, right?
Yep.
So the kids might be withdrawing, they might be doing some suspicious things, but young kids can be groomed too. So they could be people who aren't just like leaving. They could be a 10-year-old, right? Or 11-year-old, right? That developing body part seems to be part of the process that exploiters want, right? But I think, what else do we see?
I think one of the things that we oftentimes see is we'll see, children, especially if they have experienced some sort of sexual victimization, will start wearing different clothes, right? Mm-hmm. We oftentimes see girls wear baggier clothes, for example. They don't want their bodies to be seen in a way. And so they think, well, if I cover up my body differently, maybe it won't be seen that way, right? Sometimes we'll see that they will not, if certain people come over to the house, they won't want to be there. They'll want to be in their room, right? We'll see behavioral changes around in certain individuals, that because that person has been part of exploiting them, or has been part of touching them in a way that didn't feel right, didn't feel good. Again, I think opening that door and saying, like, I'm here. The truth of the matter is, and it's a very hard truth, is that kids choose when they want to disclose most often, right? Most often, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, any kind of, those are found out because a kid made a disclosure, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes certainly a parent finds something, or somebody else identifies something and makes a report, or takes the hospital identifies something. And those are important things, right? If you have a young child and you see changes in, when you're washing their laundry, you see things in their underwear that don't make sense or don't look right. Certainly, taking your kids for a medical exam is really important, and things like that. But a lot of times it's also recognizing that, kids will disclose if and when they're ready, which is so hard. And so the other thing I want to say is that, if your child comes to you and says something has happened to them, right? I think there can be this instinct of like, somehow I have failed them, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I, as a parent, didn't protect them. And we so often see this with parents, where there's this level of guilt, and I get that. And my number one recommendation would be that you, as a parent, seek your own therapy to work through that, especially if you have your own history of trauma or victimization. But even if you don't, to figure that out, because part of what kids, when they're disclosing that information, are taking into consideration is, can this person handle it, right? And so often they don't tell us as parents, or they don't tell other people because they want to protect us, right? Mm-hmm. And they're actually looking out for our well-being. by keeping their secret. And so it's really important that when they do disclose, whether it's to you or to someone else, whether it's immediate or there's been years that have passed, that we try our best to separate what we're going through as their parent or as their caregiver from what they're going through as our child. And so we can be there for them, and we can really be there in whatever role they need us to play. And we can even ask that, right? What role do you need me to play right now? Is it that you need me, you want me to come with you to law enforcement? Is it that you don't? Is it that, you wanted to tell me once and now you don't want to talk about it again for, another until you're ready? Like really asking and working through that. And then separately on your own, working through your own reaction to that, I think is just so important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what have you found in your experience in terms of kids disclosing and that it's not true? Because I think sometimes parents will be like, well, I just don't think that could have happened.
Yeah, so almost always when children disclose, they are telling the truth. I know we talk about kind of these false disclosures, but there's been a lot of research on this, and it's just really the amount of times that is happening is just really minuscule. And so I do think there has to be, first step forward to assume belief, right? Mm-hmm. Assume that what they're sharing with you, they are sharing with you because it did happen. And really, again, that's where getting professionals around you can really help, right? Yeah. It can help you, can help them, can take this, like, I think, again, to your point, sometimes parents feel like, okay, now I need to play the investigator, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if the person that they're saying hurt them is another family member, right? That can be very challenging, right? So taking your role, yourself out of that role of investigator is really important, and really centering yourself in the role of parent. And what am I here for? I'm here for my child. That's my number one priority in this situation, is really, really important. And then if somebody else needs to come in and serve that investigator role, if law enforcement needs to come in, then certainly allow them to do that without kind of your over involvement, right? Mm-hmm. Really helping that child or your child to understand the different roles different people play. And sometimes there can be a lot of people in the mix. There can be a medical person, there can be a mental health person, there can be law enforcement. There's all these people that can be involved, and really helping your child to know that you're there as their parent. That is your role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's say our kids do disclose something, or we find something out. Like, what is the best, most supportive thing that we could say if they have disclosed to us, or that we're talking to them about something that we think has happened, or how can we respond?
So I don't think that there is a one size fits all. And I don't think that there's a right and a wrong. I do think that, sitting there with that child and you can say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened to you, right? And just acknowledging what has happened to them and being present is so powerful, right? I think being non-judgmental, right? Sure, maybe they did break a rule, or maybe there was some things that in hindsight, but that's not what's important in that moment. What's important in that moment is that your child has just told you that an absolutely horrific thing happened to them. And what's important in that moment is that you are there for that child, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I think it can be really hard to just pause and stop and sit in that moment. Mm-hmm. I think that's especially true if you're a parent that has experienced your own victimization, right? It's hard not to have that trigger, right? Your own history. And so I think what's really critical in that moment is to try to take your time to breathe, right? To allow yourself grace. And if you do say something that you wish you hadn't, or if you do have some reaction, you can always circle back. That's another thing that I think it's really important for us to do with our children as they grow up, is to acknowledge when we didn't do our best, right? When we wish we had done something different, to say, oh gosh, I got so mad at you the other day when you came home. You were all you wanted to do is tell me about your day. And I was so stressed and I barked, and I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have, right? We are going to, as parents, make mistakes, right? We are fallible people. We are trying to figure this out. We are doing the best that we can. And so allowing ourselves some grace as well, I think, is really, really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that you're saying there's not one way, right way, because excuse me, I totally agree there. But I think that supportive part of like not moving into fixing it, right? Because whatever has happened has already happened, right? So for you to be present with your kid in that moment and just sit in that moment, like nothing in the next 30 minutes is going to make or break anything, right?
Yep. Yep,
So let's just
absolutely.
be present with that kid and acknowledge and just love on them. And it's, going at the pace that they're ready, not interrogating them with 100,000 questions. And I know it's so easy to be like, I told you to not go to that party, or I
Yes.
told you, right? Like it's so hard to not go to that place because you, as a parent, again, wanted to protect your kid, which absolutely makes sense. But that doesn't change what has happened, right? And just because you drink doesn't mean that you deserve to be trafficked or assaulted or hurt in any way. I mean, obviously, let's follow the laws and all those things, but kids are going to make mistakes and make choices that are different than what we wish they would make. And we probably made choices that our parents wish that we didn't make. And so, that did not set them up like that. I jokingly say, but in all seriousness, that like anyone should be allowed to walk around naked and people be like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like
Right.
what, like have compassion and care. Obviously, I don't want to encourage people to walk around naked. That's against the law. Don't do it. But that we come at that from an angle of like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Are
Yeah.
you, like what has happened? Not that that is an opportunity to victimize somebody, right? And so I think, when we have a brain that is working in a way that is helpful and supportive to other human beings, right? And we're not looking to take advantage of them, we are able to do that. But when you are somebody who is a predator, who is looking to victimize people, you are just looking for, that's your job, right? Like you're looking
Absolutely.
for a way to take advantage of somebody else. And so as parents, let's sit in it, and that's really hard, and just allow them to kind of like lead us. And they may not know where we're going, right? And so you could ask, like, say, could we get some help with this? Like I'm not exactly sure what to do, and I want to support you the best way I can, and I don't have all the skills to know what to do next. Could we call this person, or could we talk to this person, or figure out what the next steps are? Schools have things in place to help support kids too. They may not have all the resources in there, but they, might be able to tell us what the next steps are to do with our kids. But I think the initial disclosure is just to sit there.
Yeah,
Right? Can I hug
absolutely.
you? Can I just sit next to you? Can I be with you? Do you want to talk about it? What can I do to support you? I just love you so much. I can't do anything to take it away, but I am here now and want to do whatever I can to support you now. I think there's lots of different things we can say, but just for our kids to know that what they've said, we believe them and we want to help them.
Yes, absolutely. I think that really is critical. I will tell you that, I remember working with a youth many years ago, and she had just been trafficked by just horrific, multiple trafficking, very young, and by multiple individuals. And I remember her saying, the trafficking was bad, but it wasn't the worst thing that's happened to me. The worst thing that happened to me is that I told my mom when I was younger that I was raped, and she didn't believe me.
Mm.
So, I think we hear trafficking and we're so horrified that this could happen in our society. It feels so overwhelming. And I will tell you, for some of these children, they will not identify that as the worst thing that's happened to them. They will identify something that happened at a younger age that was more personal, where people didn't believe them, they didn't sit with them, they didn't get the care and treatment they needed. And certainly that's part of what put them at risk for later on victimization. And so I think, going back to kind of our conversation earlier, when we have these moments with our children when they're younger, whether it's, believing them when they disclose, or whether it's, teaching them important lessons because they've done something again that is cute at age 5, but not cute at age 15, we're building the scaffolding at younger ages,
Mhm.
for these potential, things that might happen later in life. And so I think you always hear bigger kids, bigger problems. If you've built a really strong foundation with those younger kids, I think it does make it easier to lean on that scaffolding as you hit some of those bigger problems later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, as we kind of wrap up, Erin, is there anything that you're feeling like you want parents to especially take away from this conversation? Because you've downloaded such really amazing information.
I think what I want parents to take away from this conversation is I don't want anyone to be so terrified that, they want to wrap their kids in bubble wrap and not ever let them leave the house, right? I think that there can be a strong desire. I have a lot of friends that are, therapists. I have a lot of friends in law enforcement, a lot of friends who are lawyers who work in this field. And there can be this strong kind of pull to just, okay, well, they're just never going to leave the house again, right? And I get that instinct, but I also really, really think that there's another epidemic happening in our kids, which is, the anxiety that we are seeing and happening in kids, and this kind of loneliness and isolation and sense of depression, especially since the pandemic. And so I really want to encourage you to balance, right, the stuff that you're hearing now with the idea that, generally speaking, the world is a safe place. It is really important for kids to have social connections, both with other children and with adults. And so we want to encourage and foster that and support that and celebrate it. And the reality is that, we can as parents do everything. I don't even know if it's possible, but perfectly. And bad things, unfortunately, can still happen to our children. And that's true of trafficking. It's also true of medical stuff. There's bad things can happen. And so, when and if those happen, there are tons of support networks around you. You do not have to go through this alone. You do not have to be alone. Please reach out. Please know you're not alone. There are people like me. There are people like you. There are, there are 1-800 numbers you can call that will tell you what local resources there are in your community. Please, please, please reach out. And the other thing is, if you're a parent and you have experienced your own prior victimization and you find that is impacting your own parenting, it's never too late to get your own self-help too, right? You can go back. I know people that went to therapy much later in life for things that happened to them in childhood, simply because they started seeing it come out in their parenting. And so, you're important too, as a parent and as a caregiver, also take care of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Erin. This has been such a helpful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again, Erin. I know this is a hard topic, but you really gave us some great advice and tips and tools on how to manage this idea of our kids could be trafficked. They could be victims of exploitation, and we want to protect them. So thank you for coming to share this information with us today. I hope that you're leaving with things that you can easily implement in your own home. I think talking to our kids, I love the idea that Erin brought up about making sure that safety is the most important thing, and that we're telling our kids that their safety is the most important thing. I think that opens a doorway to them communicating with us, along with lots of other important communication and conversations along the way. I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please like and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And if you love our episodes, please hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to so that you can get informed when we have new episodes, and keep emails coming. I love the topic suggestion request to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day.
Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.